Our life together, Kristen's and mine, felt like a dream. We had everything that people spend their whole lives chasing. We both had solid careers, ones that kept us comfortable but never too busy to enjoy the small things. Our home, though not extravagant, was warm and inviting, a place we filled with laughter, shared meals, and late-night conversations. It was the kind of home people walked into and immediately felt at ease, a place that reflected the life we had built together. Weekends were our time to explore. We'd take spontaneous trips, just the two of us, driving out to the countryside or finding a new town to visit. We always made an adventure out of it, whether hiking through forests, dining in local cafes, or simply wandering with no real plan. These moments became our tradition, our little escapes from the world, where it felt like nothing could touch us. Among our friends, we were the couple everyone looked up to. At gatherings, people would often joke that we were relationship goals. The picture of what a happy, thriving partnership should be. I admit, I wore that label proudly. It wasn't just about appearances. I genuinely believed that Kristen and I had cracked the code to a perfect marriage. We rarely fought, and when we did, it was over silly things, never anything serious. We communicated well, shared similar values, and supported each other's ambitions. She was my confidant, my best friend, the one person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. Kristen, in my eyes, was the embodiment of loyalty. She was steady, dependable, and always knew how to make things right. If I had a bad day at work, she'd know without asking and would be waiting for my favorite meal or a comforting word. There was never a doubt in my mind about her. She was my anchor, the one who kept everything grounded when life got chaotic. And while I was aware that no relationship was perfect, I believed ours came pretty close. We were building something real, something enduring, the kind of marriage people aspired to. When I thought about our future, it was always bright. I envisioned us growing old together, watching as the years passed, but our bond only deepened. We'd talk about having children, buying a bigger house someday, and maybe even moving to a quieter town where we could settle down and live out the rest of our days in peace. These weren't just dreams to me, they were plans, concrete ideas that I believed we were both working toward. I had no reason to think otherwise. I never allowed myself to entertain the possibility that something might go wrong. Not with Kristen, not with us. We had built our lives on trust and mutual respect. And because of that, I felt invincible in our relationship. Sure, I had seen other couples struggle, friends who were unfaithful or drifted apart over time. But I never saw that happening to us. We were different, or at least, that's what I told myself. Kristen had never given me a reason to doubt her, not once in all the years we'd been together. That confidence, that sense of security, was what made everything else so much harder to understand later. At the time, though, I was content. There was no fear in my mind, no nagging suspicion that something was off. Life was simple, predictable, and full of love. And in that love, I felt safe. Looking back now, I wonder how I didn't see it. How I missed the little signs. How I convinced myself that our perfect life was truly untouchable. Everything began to shift after what, at the time, seemed like an insignificant moment. It was one of those casual Friday night gatherings with friends, drinks, laughter, and the usual conversations. We had all gathered at a friend's house for a laid-back party, the kind we'd been to countless times before. Kristen was her usual self, charming, engaging, and full of life. I didn't think anything of it when she wandered off to chat with some of our friends. After all, these events were familiar territory for us, a chance to unwind and catch up with the people we cared about. But then something caught my attention. I was standing near the bar, talking to one of the guys, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kristen. She was across the room, laughing. But it wasn't just any laugh, it was the kind of laugh that felt too intimate, too personal. Her eyes were locked on Mark, one of her colleagues from work. He'd been invited that night since he was starting to become a familiar face at our social gatherings. At first, I brushed it off. Mark was friendly, a bit of a joker, and Kristen was always one to appreciate a good sense of humor. But this felt different. Kristen's laugh lingered just a bit too long, and her smile seemed a little too wide, as if she shared something with Mark that no one else in the room understood. It wasn't a big, obvious thing. Most people probably wouldn't have even noticed. But to me, it stood out like a flash of lightning in a clear sky. Her body language was relaxed, open in a way I hadn't seen with anyone else, not even our closest friends. She leaned in as he spoke, her hand briefly touching his arm as she laughed at whatever joke he made. I remember standing there, frozen for a split second. A strange feeling settled in my gut, one that I couldn't immediately explain. It was a mix of confusion and something darker, a twinge of unease that I didn't want to acknowledge. At the time, I convinced myself it was nothing. After all, Kristen and I had been together for years. We trusted each other completely. There was no reason for me to think that a simple laugh or a friendly touch meant anything more than what it was on the surface. Still, that moment stayed with me. Even as I forced myself to rejoin the conversation I'd been in, I couldn't help but glance back at them now and then, searching for some sign that I was overreacting. But they quickly returned to mingling with the rest of the group, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary after that. Kristen floated around the room, chatting with other friends as she always did, completely at ease. Mark went on to talk to others as well, and for the rest of the night, everything appeared normal. But that brief exchange had already planted a seed of doubt in my mind. It wasn't jealousy, not yet, anyway. It was more like a nagging thought in the back of my head, a whisper that something wasn't quite right. I told myself that Kristen was just being friendly. She'd always been warm and approachable with everyone, and Mark was just another one of her colleagues who joined our social circle. And yet, even as I rationalized it, the image of her laugh, her hand on his arm, kept replaying in my mind like a scene I couldn't forget. I didn't bring it up to her that night. There was no point in starting an argument over something so small, something that was probably just my imagination running wild. But from that moment on, things began to shift, even if I didn't realize it at the time. That seemingly insignificant moment became the first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the woman I trusted with everything. As time went on, I began to notice more and more things that didn't sit right with me. Little by little, those seemingly small moments that I had brushed aside started to pile up, each one feeding a growing sense of unease I couldn't shake. What had started with that seemingly innocent laugh at the party turned into a series of strange behaviors from Kristen, subtle at first but impossible to ignore. It began with her staying late at work more often than usual. At first, it wasn't a big deal. We both had demanding jobs. And there were always times when work overflowed into the evening. But suddenly, it became a regular thing. "I've got a big project," she'd say. "We're under a deadline." These were reasonable explanations, and I had no reason to doubt them at the time. But as the late nights increased in frequency, something felt off. There was a shift in the air. It wasn't just the extra hours, it was the way she would come home afterward. Kristen would walk through the door with a strange, almost secretive smile on her face, one I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the tired, worn-out expression that used to accompany long workdays. No, this smile had an edge to it, like she was keeping something to herself, something that brought her a private satisfaction. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. It was there every time she walked in late, her cheeks flushed in a way that didn't match the exhaustion of a long day at the office. And when I asked her how work had been, she'd give vague, nonchalant answers before quickly changing the subject. Then there was her phone. Kristen had never been particularly secretive about her phone before. We both had the usual level of privacy but nothing extreme. We'd often leave our phones lying around, and if one of us needed to use the others, it wasn't a big deal. But now, things were different. I started noticing that she would immediately lock her phone whenever I entered the room, or she'd flip it over so the screen faced down. Sometimes, I'd see her texting, and the moment I walked in, she'd stop abruptly, as if she didn't want me to see who she was talking to. I couldn't help but wonder why she was suddenly being so cautious with her phone. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was planning a surprise for me or talking to her girlfriends about something personal. But the frequency of it, the way she would become flustered if I asked who she was texting, was hard to ignore. One night, I casually mentioned it, asking, "Who keeps you so busy on your phone?" She laughed it off, saying it was just work or something trivial, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. It was a small interaction, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth. As the days turned into weeks, these little things began to build. Kristen's unexplained absences, the late nights, the hidden phone, the vague answers. None of it was glaring evidence of anything specific, but it all combined into something that weighed heavily on me. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself that I was overthinking things. that she was just busy with work, and that there was no reason to doubt her. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the gnawing feeling inside me wouldn't go away. Even her demeanor seemed different. There was a distance growing between us that I couldn't pinpoint or explain. She was still affectionate, still attentive in most ways, but there was something missing, something that used to be there but had slowly faded. Our conversations felt a little more surface level, our time together a bit more routine. I caught myself wondering whether it was just the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship or whether it was something deeper, something I didn't want to acknowledge. Late at night, when she was asleep beside me, I'd lie awake, replaying every interaction in my mind. I'd think about the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, how she seemed more distant, and how there were moments when I felt like I was living with a stranger. It was as though a wall had been built between us, one that I couldn't see but could feel. I didn't have concrete proof that anything was wrong. There were no blatant signs, no incriminating evidence. But the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she acted around me, and the creeping sense of detachment were impossible to ignore. My mind began to spiral, turning every minor detail into something larger, something potentially devastating. And so, the suspicion started to take root. It was still small, still something I could push aside in my more rational moments. But it was there, lurking in the back of my mind, quietly growing as each strange occurrence added fuel to the fire. The doubt had been planted, and though I wasn't ready to confront it yet, I couldn't deny that the perfect world I thought we lived in was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. One night, after weeks of suspicion gnawing away at me, I decided I couldn't take it any longer. Kristen had already fallen asleep, her breathing slow and steady, completely unaware of the storm brewing in my mind. I lay next to her in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest as thoughts raced through my head. Every strange moment, every unexplained late night and every time she locked her phone in front of me came rushing back, colliding in a chaotic mess of doubts. I had told myself over and over that I was just being paranoid, that there was no real reason to question her. But at that moment, I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. I needed to know. I needed to put my mind at ease or confront whatever truth was waiting for me. Her phone lay on the nightstand, just inches from my hand. I hesitated for a moment, my conscience wrestling with the idea of invading her privacy. But the weight of suspicion was too heavy, and the need for answers was overwhelming. I carefully reached over, picking up her phone with trembling hands. My palms were sweaty, and my heart was beating so loudly I was afraid it would wake her up. As I unlocked her phone, my stomach churned with guilt and fear. I knew that once I did this, there was no turning back. I was crossing the line, but the thought of not knowing was unbearable. I opened her messages and began scrolling, my fingers shaking as I searched for something, anything, that would prove my suspicions wrong. And then I saw it. Mark's name. It felt like a punch to the gut. My breath caught in my throat as I opened their conversation. What I saw next shattered the last bit of hope I had been clinging to. The messages were filled with playful banter, laced with flirtation and innuendo. At first, it seemed subtle, compliments on how she looked at work, inside jokes I didn't understand. But the further I scrolled, the more blatant it became. There were photos, nothing explicit, but intimate in a way that made my blood boil. She had sent him pictures of herself, her smiling in ways she hadn't smiled at me in months, a glimpse of her in a dress I hadn't seen her wear around me, moments that felt like they should have belonged to us. The messages escalated. Hidden beneath layers of flirtation were clear admissions of attraction. I can't stop thinking about you, one read, followed by a heart emoji. Another message from him, sent late at night, read, last night was incredible. I wish we had more time. My heart sank. I felt physically ill as I scrolled further, my eyes wide with shock and disbelief. I had suspected something was wrong, but I hadn't prepared myself for the reality of it. My hands shook as I continued reading, but it was the photos that sent me over the edge. There were pictures she had sent to him, not explicit, but just enough to make the message clear. Pictures of her in outfits I'd never seen, poses meant for his eyes only. I felt sick, like I had just been punched in the stomach, unable to breathe properly as my mind raced. The messages that followed left no doubt. Flirtatious exchanges, hidden meanings, late-night confessions of how much they couldn't wait to see each other again. I felt a surge of anger, but also an overwhelming sadness. The woman I had trusted with everything, the woman I had built a life with. Was sharing a part of herself with someone else. Someone she had brought into our lives, into our circle of friends, as if it were nothing. The worst part was how casual it all seemed. They talked like they had been doing this for months, comfortable in their secret world, completely oblivious to the fact that I was lying in bed next to her, reading every word. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat there in the dark, staring at her, wondering how long this had been going on and how I hadn't seen it sooner. Every touch, every kiss, every moment we had shared over the past few months now felt tainted, a lie wrapped in a false sense of security. My mind raced with questions. When had it started? How many times had she lied to me? How much of our life together had been real, and how much had been a facade? The betrayal cut deep, a wound I knew would never fully heal. I wanted to wake her up and confront her right then and there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the sheer shock of it all. The overwhelming sense of disbelief that this was happening. Instead, I put her phone back on the nightstand, carefully, as if nothing had happened. I stared at her peaceful face, wondering how she could sleep so soundly while my entire world was crashing down around me. That night, as she lay beside me, completely unaware of the storm raging in my mind, I made a decision. This wasn't going to end quietly. Kristen had taken something from me, something that I could never get back, my trust. My sense of security, my belief in the life we had built. And for that, she would pay. I couldn't just walk away. That thought burned in my mind as I replayed the messages I'd seen on her phone. Leaving her. That would have been the easy way out, but it wouldn't have been enough. Kristen had betrayed me in a way that went beyond just infidelity. She'd torn apart the life we had built, the trust I'd given her, and the future I thought we shared. She had to pay for that, but not in some quiet, private way. No, she needed to lose everything, just like I had lost everything the moment I discovered her affair. That's when the idea came to me, a cold, calculated plan. Our annual trip with friends was coming up soon, the one we'd been planning for months. Every year, we and a close-knit group of friends rented a house in the mountains for a long weekend getaway. It was a tradition, something we all looked forward to, and Kristen had been particularly excited about it this year. She'd spent weeks talking about how much fun it would be to escape work and spend time with everyone. It was the perfect opportunity. What better way to reveal her secret than in front of everyone she cared about? Her friends, our friends, people who saw her as this perfect, loyal wife, they'd all be there. I imagined the look on her face when the truth came out, the shock, the shame, and how quickly the world she thought she had control over would crumble in front of her. The idea of exposing her so publicly, of making her feel the humiliation she had forced on me, consumed my thoughts. I wanted her to lose everything, her friends, her dignity, the respect everyone had for her. I wanted her to feel the sting of betrayal, not just from me, but from the people she thought would always be by her side. I pictured the scene in my head, how it would play out, how everyone would react when I revealed her affair with Mark. Kristen wouldn't just lose me, she would lose the life she had so carefully constructed. The more I thought about it, the more the plan solidified in my mind. I wouldn't confront her right away. No, that would ruin everything. She needed to believe that everything was still fine, that I was still the same clueless husband who adored her, who trusted her implicitly. I would play the part, let her feel secure, and when the time was right, I'd pull the rug out from under her. I started acting as if nothing had changed. It wasn't easy at first. Every time I looked at her, I felt a surge of anger. But I had to bury it deep down. I had to make her believe that I was still the man she had fooled for months. So, I played the game. I complimented her, told her how beautiful she looked, and kissed her with the same tenderness I had always shown her. I made sure she felt comfortable, and that she had no idea what was coming. We continued planning the trip together. Kristen was oblivious to the storm brewing behind my calm exterior. She talked excitedly about the weekend getaway, about how nice it would be to relax with everyone. "It'll be just what we need," she'd say, her eyes lighting up as she described all the activities we'd do with our friends, the hiking, the wine nights, the cozy dinners by the fire. She had no idea that for me, this trip had taken on a much darker significance. I kept up appearances with our friends as well, making sure no one suspected anything. I didn't want to raise any red flags, didn't want anyone to get the slightest hint that something was wrong. As far as they knew, we were still the same couple. Solid and happy. Kristen played her part perfectly, too. She had no reason to believe I knew about her and Mark, so she acted like everything was normal. She probably thought she had me wrapped around her finger, that I was completely blind to her betrayal. I knew that by keeping my cool, I was giving her a false sense of security, letting her believe that everything was under control. But I took a certain satisfaction in that, in knowing that while she was making plans for what she thought would be a fun, carefree weekend, I was planning something far more devastating. I would wait until we were all together when she least expected it. I imagined how the truth would hit her like a freight train, how her world would come crashing down in front of everyone she cared about. The hardest part was pretending that I still cared. I had to touch her, hold her, and laugh at her jokes, all the while knowing that I was counting down the days until her life as she knew it would be destroyed. There were moments when I wanted to scream at her, confront her, and let the anger I felt finally erupt. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to stay patient, to wait for the right moment. In the days leading up to the trip, I made sure everything was in place. I arranged for all our friends to be there, subtly steering the conversations toward how excited everyone was about the weekend. Kristen and I packed our bags together, talking about the usual things: what to bring, what meals we'd cook, the hikes we wanted to do. She smiled at me and kissed me on the cheek, completely unaware that I was just days away from exposing her darkest secret. And so, I played my part perfectly. Every touch, every word, every loving gesture was part of the act. Inside, I was a storm of rage, but on the outside, I was the doting husband she believed I still was. The trip was set, and with every passing day, I could feel the moment approaching, the moment when everything would fall apart for Kristen, just as it had for me. The first night of the trip seemed perfect. Almost too perfect. We had all arrived at the cozy cabin in the mountains, our bags unpacked, and the familiar energy of excitement buzzed among our friends. The air was crisp, and the sky stretched out in a blanket of stars above us. The fireplace crackled warmly as we gathered around the long wooden dining table for our first dinner together. Laughter filled the room, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like nothing had changed, like we were just a group of close friends on a carefree getaway. As we had done countless times before. But I knew better. Beneath the surface, tension simmered, at least for me. My eyes constantly flicked toward Kristen and Mark, observing every small interaction between them. At first glance, everything seemed innocent. Kristen laughed with the group, her smile wide and bright, the same smile she used to give me. Mark, sitting across the table from her, joined in the jokes, his laughter blending in with everyone else's. To anyone else, they were just two colleagues and friends, enjoying the evening like everyone else. But I saw through it. The way they exchanged glances, subtle but undeniable, spoke volumes. Their eyes met too often, lingering just a moment longer than they should have. There was a familiarity between them, a secret language that only they shared. Kristen's hand would rest on the table, and I noticed how Mark's gaze would drift toward her fingers as if he was remembering something intimate. I watched as she laughed a little too hard at his jokes, her eyes sparkling in a way that made my stomach turn. It was infuriating how effortlessly they seemed to carry on their charade as if I didn't exist, as if no one could see the truth hidden in plain sight. The rest of our friends, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued laughing and joking around. We passed plates of food, shared stories from the past year, and made toasts to old friendships. I forced myself to join in, knowing that I couldn't afford to raise any suspicions just yet. I had to play along, to act like everything was fine, even though every fiber of my being wanted to explode with the anger I had been holding back for so long. Kristen, sitting next to me, leaned in and whispered something in my ear, something sweet, something affectionate. I can't even remember the words because they felt so empty, so hollow. How could she say those things to me when I knew what was going on? I turned and smiled at her, pretending that her words still meant something, even though the bitterness in my chest grew heavier with every passing minute. I watched her laugh, I watched her talk, and all the while, my mind was racing. It was hard to be this close to her, to play the part of the loving husband while knowing that she had betrayed me. I wanted to confront her right there, to stand up and tell everyone what she had done. But I couldn't. Not yet. This was only the beginning. The real confrontation would come later, and when it did, it would be unforgettable. Mark, for his part, seemed comfortable, even relaxed. He had no idea that I knew. He had no idea that this weekend would be the turning point for both of them. I watched him interact with everyone, including me, as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't been sneaking around behind my back. The thought of how easily he had inserted himself into my life, into my marriage, made my blood boil. But I kept my cool. I had to. The dinner continued, and as the night went on, we moved to the living room. Sinking into the soft couches with glasses of wine. Kristen and Mark sat across from each other, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the tension between them. It was subtle, a fleeting glance here, a soft smile there, but it was enough to confirm everything I already knew. They thought they were being discreet, but I had been watching them too closely to miss even the smallest of signs. Despite the rage bubbling under the surface, I knew I had to wait. The timing was everything, and I wasn't ready to play my hand just yet. The weekend had only just begun, and there was still plenty of time to execute my plan. For now, I let them think they had fooled me, let them believe they were safe. But inside, I was counting down the moments until the facade they had so carefully constructed would come crashing down. As the fire crackled in the background and our friends' laughter echoed through the room, I took a long sip of my drink and leaned back, watching Kristen and Mark as they stole another glance at each other. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that the next few days would change everything. For tonight, I would play along. But soon, the game would be mine to control. The second day of the trip dawned bright and sunny, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling within me. As we gathered for breakfast, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and bacon filled the air, but my stomach was in knots. I knew I had to set the stage for my plan to unfold. Today was the day I would introduce a delicate topic that would lead to the real revelation later. As we all sat around the large dining table, sharing plates and stories, I seized the opportunity. You know, I began casually, trying to keep my tone light. I've been thinking a lot about marriage and fidelity lately. I watched as my friends looked up, intrigued by my sudden shift in conversation. It wasn't a typical breakfast topic, but I could feel the tension in the air shift, as if everyone knew this was going to be a conversation worth having. Marriage can be such a tricky thing. I continued, leaning back in my chair, gauging their reactions. I mean, it's all about trust, right? Without that, what do you have? My friends nodded, some exchanging glances, clearly engaged. They took the bait, ready to share their thoughts and experiences. Absolutely, said Lisa, one of our closest friends. Trust is everything. I can't imagine being with someone I didn't completely trust. I kept my gaze steady, but inside, I was simmering. Kristen sat beside me, oblivious to the underlying tension in my words. I could feel her fidget slightly, the weight of my gaze on her a reminder of how the game was changing. This was a conversation she couldn't escape, and the irony was delicious. You know, I said, leaning in a bit, it's interesting how easily trust can be broken. It only takes one mistake, one moment of weakness. It's like you can't go back once it's gone. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, knowing that they were loaded with implications. I was deliberately pushing buttons, hoping to provoke a reaction. Kristen shifted in her seat, her expression shifting to one of concern. I think that's why communication is so important, she said, her voice steady but a touch defensive. If you're honest with each other, there shouldn't be any room for misunderstandings. I couldn't help but scoff inwardly. The hypocrisy was unbearable. Here she was, preaching about communication and honesty while I knew the truth about her betrayal. I maintained my composure, forcing a smile as I encouraged her. Exactly. It's all about being open with each other. I think if both partners are committed, they can work through anything. Mark chimed in, completely unaware of the underlying tension. You just have to be able to trust each other. If you can't do that, then what's the point? You end up just living a lie. As he spoke, I watched Kristen closely. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to him and then back to me, clearly sensing the intensity of the conversation. I could see the wheels turning in her mind. But I had her trapped. She had to engage, to defend her viewpoint, while the truth loomed large behind her facade. Trust is a cornerstone, she finally added, trying to maintain her composure. I think we should all be thankful for the relationships we have. It's a privilege to have people in your life who you can rely on. Her words felt like a punch in the gut, but I held my ground, forcing a nod of agreement. Exactly, Kristen, it's a privilege, but I can't help but wonder how many people take that privilege for granted. The conversation continued, weaving through various anecdotes and personal stories about relationships, fidelity, and the challenges of marriage. Each time someone shared a story, I found a way to steer it back to the core theme of trust. My heart raced as I watched Kristen respond, her demeanor a mix of defensiveness and discomfort. I was slowly tightening the noose, forcing her to confront the weight of her own words. As the discussion deepened, I felt a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The irony of her participating in this conversation while harboring her secrets was almost too much to bear. I could see the cracks beginning to form in her confidence, the facade she had built starting to fray. It was only a matter of time before the truth would break through. By the time we finished breakfast, I could sense the tension in the room had shifted. My friends were more introspective, considering their relationships and the challenges that came with them. But for me, it was a small victory. I had successfully planted the seeds of doubt and discomfort, and Kristen was starting to feel the pressure. As we cleared the table and moved to the living room for a game, I caught her eye briefly. The look she gave me was a mix of confusion and concern. Did she realize how close I was to unveiling her secret? Did she feel the ground shifting beneath her? I smiled back, a calm facade masking the chaos inside me. I was ready to continue the game, knowing that soon, I would have the chance to reveal her betrayal. And when that moment came, it would be just as explosive as I had planned. The stakes were high, and the tension was palpable, but I was in control, and I relished every moment of it. The third night of our getaway arrived, cloaked in a tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. Everyone gathered around the table for dinner, laughter, and chatter mingling with the scent of grilled steaks and roasted vegetables. As the conversation flowed, I felt a mix of excitement and dread churning in my stomach. The moment I had meticulously planned for was finally upon me. As we settled into our meal, I noticed Kristen across the table, laughing and joking with our friends, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The way she carried herself, so carefree, only fueled my resolve. I knew I had to pull the trigger tonight. There was no turning back now. After a few rounds of jokes and shared stories, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey, everyone," I called out, forcing a casual tone into my voice, even as I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "Can I have everyone's attention for just a second?" The chatter died down, and all eyes turned toward me. I could see the curiosity and confusion in their expressions. Kristen's laughter faded as she turned to me, a look of bewilderment crossing her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped my phone, the device that held the damning evidence of her betrayal. "Kristen and I have something important to share with all of you. Something that I think you deserve to know." The atmosphere in the room shifted, tension coiling tightly around us. I could see Kristen's eyes widen, a flicker of fear crossing her features. She was starting to understand that something was not right. I continued, my voice steadying as I prepared to reveal the truth. "I want you all to know how important trust is in a relationship. You've all heard us talk about it, but tonight, I need to show you just how fragile that trust can be." I glanced at Kristen, whose expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Without another moment's hesitation, I pulled up her messages with Mark, the very evidence of her betrayal, and held the phone up for everyone to see. "This is Kristen's conversation with Mark," I said, my voice ringing with an authority that surprised even me. "And I think it's time for everyone to see exactly what's been going on behind closed doors." The room fell into a suffocating silence as the screen illuminated with their exchange. My friends leaned in, squinting at the phone, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Kristen's face drained of color as she realized what I was doing. Her mouth opened in disbelief, but no words came out. "Look at this," I said, scrolling through the messages, my heart pounding louder than the silence that enveloped us. The playful banter, the flirty remarks, the photos that had crossed the line, all laid bare for our friends to see. I could feel the tension in the room thickening, the weight of betrayal pressing down on all of us. "Oh my God," Lisa breathed, her hand flying to her mouth as she glanced between me and Kristen. "Kristen, is this real?" Kristen shook her head, her eyes wide, desperately searching for words. "David, please, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like," she exclaimed, her voice cracking under the strain of disbelief. But I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that her perfect world was shattering in front of her. Mark, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly looked pale. His expression shifted from shock to guilt, and I could see the recognition of his involvement dawning on him. Kristen, I didn't know you were, he began, but I cut him off. This isn't about him, I snapped, my anger flaring as I glared at Mark. This is about you, Kristen. You stood in front of me, looked me in the eyes, and lied. You played me for a fool while you were texting him behind my back. The silence that followed was deafening. My friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between us, unsure of how to react. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily in the room, and I could feel the tension rising as Kristen struggled to gather herself. I swear, David, it was just a mistake. She pleaded, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was confused. It was just a phase. Her desperation only fueled my resolve, the weight of her betrayal hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Confused? I echoed, disbelief washing over me. You think confusion justifies this? Do you think you can play both sides and expect it all to be okay? Look at what you've done. The conversation turned into chaos as my friends began to react, voicing their shock and disbelief. I can't believe this, one of them murmured, while another exclaimed, Kristen, how could you? Kristen sat frozen, her face a mix of horror and regret. I could see the tears welling in her eyes, but I didn't care. She had destroyed everything we had built together, and now she was facing the consequences. Now you all know, I said, my voice unwavering, what happens when trust is broken. I hope you understand how easily it can all fall apart. I felt a sense of triumph surge within me as the realization settled in. The facade she had maintained was crumbling, and she was exposed for everyone to see. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, the weight of betrayal thick in the air as my friends processed what had just unfolded. I had done what I set out to do. I had revealed the truth. As I lowered the phone and looked around the room, I knew this was just the beginning of the fallout. Kristen was facing the reality of her actions, and I was ready to watch the consequences unfold. The silence that had settled was heavy, filled with shock and disbelief, and at that moment, I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness for what had been lost. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the climax of my carefully crafted revenge. And I was ready to see how it would all play out from here. The atmosphere in the room was electric, charged with disbelief and shock as my friends processed what had just transpired. Eyes wide, mouths agape, they turned from the messages on the screen to Kristen, who was now visibly trembling, struggling to find words that would justify her actions. Kristen, how could you? Lisa finally managed, her voice breaking the stunned silence. Other friends echoed her sentiments, disbelief etched on their faces as they grappled with the reality of the situation. The camaraderie that had once defined our circle was now shattered, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Kristen's attempts to explain herself were met with dismissive glances and shaking heads. You don't understand, she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. But her words fell on deaf ears. The gravity of her betrayal hung heavy in the air, drowning out any justification she tried to offer. I stood there, a cold satisfaction washing over me as I witnessed her world crumble. This was the moment I had envisioned, the culmination of my plan. Kristen, once so confident and self-assured, was now the center of disdain and pity. Her carefully constructed facade had collapsed, and I felt a sense of vindication watching her unravel before our friends. The conversations that had once flowed so easily were now replaced by an uneasy silence. My friends exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. Some looked sympathetic, while others were outright angry. I could see the shift in their perception of Kristen. She was no longer the beloved friend but a woman who had betrayed not just me but the entire group. As the weight of her actions settled in, I felt a deep sense of closure. Kristen was losing everything, me, our relationship, and now, the trust of those around her. At that moment, I realized the true cost of her betrayal. She had sacrificed not only our love but also the bonds she shared with our friends. Watching her break down, I felt a mix of emotions, sorrow for what we had lost, but mostly satisfaction that she was facing the consequences of her actions. Kristen had played with fire and now stood alone, surrounded by the remnants of her choices. The realization that she was truly losing the support of those she cared about hit her hard. She glanced around the room, searching for an ally, but all she found were looks of disappointment. I knew she would never be able to reclaim the trust she had shattered. As the conversations grew quiet, I made my way outside, needing a moment to breathe. The night air felt cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the chaos inside. I took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction of my revenge wash over me. I had succeeded in exposing her betrayal, and now it was time for her to face the reality of her choices. Inside, I could hear muffled voices as my friends continued to grapple with the fallout. I had played my hand perfectly, and I knew that this moment would forever change the dynamics of our friendship. Kristen's betrayal would not be forgotten, and neither would the pain it had caused. In that moment of solitude, I understood the finality of what had happened. There was no turning back, no repairing the damage done. Kristen had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it alone. I had taken back my power. And in doing so, I had set the stage for a new beginning, free from the shadows of her deceit.